Singapore is known for being an exciting destination, a highly developed nation with a vibrant nightlife. However, it is also home to some of the most brutal drug laws in the world.
The recent execution of Tanggaraju Suppiah and of another man for drug trafficking has brought international attention to what this country does to people that use drugs. The Singaporean Misuse of Drugs Act of 1973 issues out hard sentences for people that use drugs. This includes caning and the death penalty. The Ministry of Home Affairs is doing this to try and create some sort of drug-free society because that's something that's possible, right? Or that we want. For possession, the maximum offense that you can be given is 10 years or a fine of $20,000. Having syringes, bongs, or other drug paraphernalia can give you a maximum sentence of 3 years or a fine of $10,000 or both. Now, the death penalty is almost exclusively used for drugs. There's 54 people that are in death row right now in Singapore, and 51 of them are for drug offenses. It's even illegal for Singaporeans to use drugs abroad, even if they're legal in the place that they try them. If you are discovered on your way back to Singapore that you have used drugs and you come out with a positive test, you're going to be tried with domestic laws for your crime. Mandatory minimums exist for cannabis, cocaine, opium, heroin, and methamphetamine, as these are considered the most harmful drugs to society. The death penalty is automatically applied to anyone that is carrying or found carrying any of the following quantities of these drugs. This can also include caning of up to 25 lashes. People caught with less of the mandatory minimum for the death sentence may be given up to 24 strokes of the cane or life imprisonment, whatever you would prefer. Police also don't require warrants to search houses if they're suspecting that there's drugs inside them. They can demand a urine or a hair test from anyone that they suspect that has used drugs. Failure to give a urine sample can lead up to 10 years of imprisonment or a $20,000 fine. Some people may be directed to drug detention centers, which are called treatment services in Singapore, where you will probably have to be living out your sentence if you're considered to be addicted. This usually means a minimum of 12 months within a rehab clinic or a maximum of 4 years in one single facility. To get some more details about the reality on the ground, we spoke with a group of activists that are campaigning to abolish the death penalty in Singapore.
Hi, my name is Kokila and I work for the Transformative Justice Collective. We're an abolitionist group based in Singapore, and we fight for progressive drug policy reform, the end of capital punishment, and alternatives to prisons and policing. Healthcare professionals are obliged to report mandatorily to the authorities if somebody comes in for help from a healthcare professional and tests positive for drugs. So this leads to a situation where people who use drugs live in a lot of fear, shame, and isolation. They're at higher risk of overdose deaths because people are afraid to call emergency services because they're afraid of being reported to the Central Narcotics Bureau. Many people on death row for drug use in Singapore tend to be people who have had a history of drug dependence themselves. So there's about 3,300 plus people in our drug detention centers as of the end of last year. And out of about 7,660 people in prison, close to 60% are there for drug offenses. So that's separate to those in the drug detention centers. We see many definite indications that public opinion is shifting away from the death penalty for drugs and also towards better care, treatment, harm reduction services, and support for people who use drugs. I think there is definitely more awareness that a public health approach is perhaps more valuable than a prohibitionist approach.
While there's been a lot of international attention around the execution of certain individuals, the Singaporean government has remained completely silent in the face of all these executions that are happening for drugs. In fact, it's frequent for the government to put out data showing the widespread public support for the Singaporean use of the death penalty. Almost 75% of the surveyed population said that they supported the use of the death penalty for drug trafficking because they believed it was an effective deterrent to be bringing in drugs into the country.
Singapore is generally quite influential in the region, especially in not just with drug laws, but in its authoritarian mechanisms and regime is quite popular with many governments in the region. And we have heard from drug reform advocates in many other countries in Southeast Asia that their governments hold Singapore up as a model, and that Singapore's very strong prohibitionist approaches actually makes their work in pushing for more evidence-based, humane approaches very hard in their own countries, because Singapore is also extremely effective, the government's very effective in its propaganda. And so a lot of the governments in neighboring countries buy into Singapore's harsh stances too. And there's no independent media reporting on the effects of Singapore's war on drugs. So the only information that people outside of Singapore get is the state propaganda. And so that, really impacts our ability to impact the discourse in many other ways too. You'd see that even many families of people on death row are very afraid to speak up. They're afraid that if they speak to the media or they, even write on social media or attend any of our events, their loved ones on death row will get worse treatment. They're afraid that they'll lose their jobs. And we know family members who've lost their jobs as a result of campaigning against the death penalty.
The use of the death penalty for any crime is a horrific practice. But in Singapore, what we're seeing is the systematic criminalization and the destruction of rights of people that use drugs, including their right to access health, education, and legal advice when needed. And while the region has seen some law changes, with Thailand recently legalizing the use of medical cannabis and Malaysia moving towards decriminalizing the possession of drugs, Singapore still holds a lot of influence within the region. If there is no international condemnation of the use of the death penalty, this practice is going to continue unabated, and we're going to keep seeing people that use drugs die over and over again. We're going to continue reporting on the use of the death penalty around drugs throughout this year. So if you want to follow our work and also follow the work of the Transformative Justice Collective, you can find their links below in this video and find out what you can do to support their international campaigns.